The morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as the yellow school bus rumbled to its first stop of the day. Behind the oversized steering wheel, Frank Morrison adjusted his rearview mirror and checked his watch, 7:15 a.m., right on schedule. At 62 years old, Frank had been driving this same route through the suburbs of Cedar Falls, Ohio, for nearly 15 years. He knew every pothole, every stop sign, and most importantly, every child who climbed aboard his bus each morning. But lately, one particular passenger had been weighing heavily on his mind, a quiet 8-year-old girl named Emma, who sat in the same seat every day, tears streaming down her small face as she stared out the window. Frank had seen his share of upset children over the years. First-day jitters, forgotten homework, friendship drama. He'd witnessed it all. But Emma's tears were different. They weren't the dramatic sobs of a child throwing a tantrum, or the sniffles of someone nursing hurt feelings. These were silent, steady tears that seemed to carry the weight of something far too heavy for such young shoulders. What troubled Frank even more was how she tried to hide them, quickly wiping her cheeks whenever she thought someone might be looking, clutching a worn backpack to her chest like a shield against the world. The school district had strict policies about driver-student interactions, and Frank respected those boundaries. But as the days turned into weeks, and Emma's tears showed no sign of stopping, something deep in his gut told him that this little girl was in real trouble. He'd raised 3 daughters of his own and had learned to trust his instincts when it came to children in distress. Emma wasn't just having a bad day or a rough week. She was crying every single morning, and Frank was beginning to suspect that whatever was causing her pain was happening at home. Before we continue, tell us where you're listening from today in the comments below. If you enjoy stories with unexpected twists and moments of justice, please consider subscribing. Frank's alarm clock buzzed at 5:30 a.m. sharp, the same time it had for the past 15 years. His wife Margaret rolled over and mumbled something about coffee as he padded barefoot across the cold hardwood floor to their small kitchen. The house on Elm Street was modest but comfortable, filled with family photos and the lingering scent of last night's pot roast. As he poured water into the coffee maker, Frank found his thoughts already drifting to Route 47, his assigned path through the Cedar Falls School District. The routine was sacred to Frank. Check the bus for safety violations, review his passenger list, and prepare mentally for the 43 children who would depend on him to get them safely to Riverside Elementary. But over the past month, his morning ritual had taken on an additional weight. As he drove past the familiar landmarks, Murphy's Hardware, the old oak tree that had weathered countless storms, the blue Victorian house where Mrs. Chen always waved from her kitchen window, his mind inevitably wandered to seat number 12, third row back on the right side, where Emma Parker would soon be sitting with tears in her eyes. The first time Frank noticed Emma crying, he'd assumed it was a temporary situation. Maybe her parents were going through a divorce, or perhaps she'd lost a beloved pet. Children wore their emotions openly, and tears were often their first response to change or loss. But as days turned into weeks, and Emma's silent weeping became as predictable as the sunrise, Frank's concern deepened into something approaching alarm. The other children seemed oblivious to her distress, caught up in their own chatter about weekend plans and upcoming tests. But Frank saw everything from his perch behind the steering wheel, and what he saw troubled him more each day. Emma was always the third child to board at the Sycamore Street stop. She climbed the steps slowly, never making eye contact with Frank, despite his warm, good morning greeting. Her blonde hair, once neatly braided according to Frank's mental notes from earlier in the school year, had become increasingly disheveled. Her clothes, while clean, seemed to hang loosely on her small frame, and Frank had noticed that she never carried the lunch boxes or snack bags that the other children brought from home. The girl would make her way to seat 12 without fail, sliding across the worn vinyl to the window side, where she would press her forehead against the glass and begin her daily ritual of silent tears. She clutched an old backpack, faded purple with fraying straps, so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Frank had watched her in his rearview mirror countless times, noting how she seemed to curl into herself, making her already small body even smaller, as if trying to disappear entirely. What haunted Frank most was the way Emma tried to hide her crying. When other children turned around, or when the bus hit a bump that might draw attention her way, she would quickly swipe at her cheeks with the sleeve of her sweater. It was a practiced motion, too practiced for a child her age, suggesting that hiding tears was something she'd learned to do well before stepping onto Frank's bus. Frank had attempted small gestures of kindness, adjusting the rearview mirror to catch her eye and offer a reassuring smile, playing softer music on the bus radio, even keeping a small container of tissues near the driver's seat in case she needed them. But Emma remained unreachable, locked in her private world of sorrow that seemed to intensify rather than diminish with each passing day. The other children on the bus had their own social dynamics and hierarchies. There was Tommy, the class clown who kept everyone entertained with jokes and impressions. Sarah and her best friend Jenna, who spent every bus ride whispering secrets and giggling about boys. The Martinez twins, who argued good-naturedly in rapid Spanish while sharing earbuds to listen to music. But Emma existed apart from all of it, an island of quiet desperation in a sea of childhood normalcy. Frank had been driving school buses long enough to recognize the signs of trouble. He'd reported suspected abuse cases before, following proper protocols and working with school administrators to ensure children's safety. But those cases had involved obvious physical signs: bruises, cuts, dramatic behavioral changes. Emma's situation was more subtle, more complex, and infinitely more heartbreaking because of its quiet persistence. As he completed his pre-route inspection on this particular Tuesday morning, checking mirrors, lights, and emergency exits with methodical precision, Frank made a decision. He couldn't continue to simply observe Emma's suffering without taking some kind of action. The district's policies were clear about maintaining appropriate boundaries, but Frank's conscience was equally clear about his responsibility to protect the children in his care. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the maple trees that lined Sycamore Street were just beginning to show hints of red and gold. Frank climbed into the driver's seat and adjusted his mirrors one final time before starting the engine. In 20 minutes, he would reach Emma's stop, and she would board his bus with tears already beginning to form in her eyes. But today, Frank decided, would be different. Today he was going to find a way to reach her, even if it meant bending a few rules in the process. Frank's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual as he navigated the familiar streets towards Sycamore Avenue. The weight of his decision sat heavy in his chest, but his resolve only strengthened as he thought about Emma's tear-stained face. He'd spent the previous evening researching the proper channels for reporting concerns about student welfare, but something told him that filing an official report without concrete evidence might not be enough to help this little girl. The bus stop at Sycamore and 3rd Street was typical of the neighborhood. A small cluster of children waiting beneath a towering oak tree, backpacks slung over shoulders, lunchboxes in hand. Frank could see them from 2 blocks away. The Hendricks boys, roughhousing as usual, little Sophia Martinez carefully protecting her new sneakers from imaginary puddles, and there, standing slightly apart from the group, was Emma. Even from a distance, Frank could see that something was different about her this morning. Her usually neat school uniform appeared wrinkled, as if she'd slept in it, and she was hugging that purple backpack even more tightly than usual. As the bus wheezed to a stop and the doors folded open with their familiar hydraulic sigh, Frank prepared himself for what he now thought of as his daily heartbreak. "Morning, everyone," he called out in his practiced cheerful tone, but his eyes were focused entirely on Emma as she climbed the steps. Today, her tears had started even before she reached her seat, and Frank noticed something else that made his stomach clench with worry, a small, dark bruise on her left wrist that she was trying to hide beneath her sweater sleeve. Emma slumped into seat 12, and Frank adjusted his rearview mirror to keep her in view as the other children settled into their usual spots. The conversation around her was typical morning chatter, complaints about math homework, excitement about a field trip, speculation about what would be served for lunch. But Emma remained silent, her small frame shaking slightly as she pressed her face against the window. Frank had made a decision the night before, lying awake beside Margaret as she slept peacefully. If he was going to help Emma, he needed to understand what was happening to her outside of their 20-minute bus rides. The school district's database contained basic information about each student: addresses, emergency contacts, parent names, but Frank knew that official records rarely told the whole story. During his lunch break, Frank drove through Emma's neighborhood with the kind of careful attention he usually reserved for icy roads and construction zones. The Parker family lived on Elm Street in a modest 2-story house with peeling paint and an overgrown front yard. The mailbox tilted at an odd angle, and several newspapers lay scattered on the front walk, suggesting that no one had bothered to collect them for days. Frank parked across the street and observed the house for several minutes. The windows were covered with heavy curtains, giving the place a closed-off, unwelcoming appearance. An older model sedan sat in the driveway, its back bumper held on with duct tape. Everything about the scene suggested a family struggling with more than just financial difficulties. That afternoon, as Frank drove his route home, he paid special attention to Emma's stop. He watched through his mirrors as she walked slowly up the cracked sidewalk toward her front door, her steps growing more hesitant with each yard she covered. Just before she reached the porch, the front door swung open, and a tall, thin woman emerged. Even from the bus, Frank could see the tension in the woman's posture as she grabbed Emma's arm and pulled her inside. The door slammed shut with enough force that Frank could hear it over the rumble of his diesel engine. Something cold settled in Frank's stomach as he continued his route. 27 years of marriage to Margaret had taught him to recognize the signs of domestic stress, and what he'd just witnessed confirmed his worst fears about Emma's home situation. But knowing something was wrong, and proving it, were two entirely different challenges. That evening, Frank sat at his kitchen table with a cup of Margaret's coffee growing cold beside him as he stared at a blank notepad. He'd started to write down everything he'd observed about Emma: the daily tears, the increasing withdrawal, the way she flinched when other children raised their voices, the bruise on her wrist. But as his list grew longer, Frank realized he was documenting a pattern of suffering without identifying its specific source. Margaret found him there an hour later, still staring at his notes. At 58, his wife had the kind of intuitive wisdom that came from raising 3 daughters and managing the emotional chaos of a household for decades. She didn't need to ask what was troubling him. She simply poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from him. "It's that little girl, isn't it?" Margaret said quietly. "The one you've been worried about." Frank nodded, grateful as always for his wife's ability to understand him without lengthy explanations. "Emma Parker, 8 years old, and she cries every single day on my bus. Today I saw a bruise on her wrist, and the way her mother grabbed her when she got home." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Margaret reached across the table and covered his weathered hand with her smaller one. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," Frank admitted. "But I can't keep watching her suffer and doing nothing. There has to be a way to help her without making things worse." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the only sound the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in their living room. Finally, Margaret squeezed his hand and spoke the words that would change everything. "Maybe you need to look closer," she said. "Really close. Sometimes the answers are right in front of us, hiding in plain sight." Frank's sleep was restless that night, filled with dreams of tear-stained faces and slammed doors. He woke before his alarm, Margaret's words echoing in his mind. "Maybe you need to look closer." As he went through his morning routine, Frank found himself approaching the day with a heightened sense of awareness, as if he were preparing for something significant to happen. The morning air was crisp with the first real bite of autumn, and the leaves on the maple trees had turned brilliant shades of orange and red. Frank completed his pre-trip inspection with extra care, checking every mirror and light, ensuring that his bus was a safe haven for the children who would soon depend on him. As he pulled away from the depot, he made a silent promise to Emma that today would be different. The first several stops proceeded normally. Children bounded up the steps with their usual energy, chattering about weekend plans and complaining about upcoming tests. Frank responded to their greetings with his customary warmth, but his attention was already focused on stop number 7, where Emma would be waiting beneath the oak tree on Sycamore Street. When he rounded the corner and saw the familiar cluster of children, Frank's heart sank. Emma stood apart from the group as always, but today her isolation seemed even more pronounced. Her school uniform was wrinkled, and appeared to be the same clothes she'd worn the day before. Her blonde hair hung in tangles around her face, and even from a distance, Frank could see the telltale signs of fresh tears. As the children boarded, Frank watched Emma through his rearview mirror with the intensity of a hawk studying its prey. She moved more slowly than usual, wincing slightly as she climbed the steps. When she passed his seat, Frank caught a glimpse of her face and felt his breath catch in his throat. What he'd initially thought was just exhaustion was actually something much more serious. Emma had the hollow, haunted look of a child who hadn't slept in days. Emma made her way to seat 12, clutching her faded purple backpack with white-knuckled determination. As she settled into her usual position against the window, Frank made a decision that would violate several district policies but might save a child's life. He was going to pay much closer attention to everything Emma did, everything she carried, and everything she tried to hide. The bus filled with its usual morning symphony of voices, laughter, and the occasional argument over seating arrangements. But Frank tuned out the familiar noise and focused entirely on his rear-view mirror, where Emma sat curled against the window with tears streaming down her face. Today, however, Frank noticed something he'd never seen before. Emma was talking. Her lips were moving in what appeared to be a whispered conversation, but there was no one sitting beside her. Frank adjusted his mirror slightly and realized that Emma wasn't talking to herself. She was talking to her backpack. More specifically, she seemed to be comforting whatever was inside it. Frank's pulse quickened as he observed Emma's behavior more closely. She would whisper something to the backpack, then pause as if listening to a response. At one point, she carefully unzipped the main compartment just an inch or two and peered inside, her expression softening in a way Frank had never seen before. The tears continued to flow down her cheeks, but her voice carried a gentle, soothing quality that suggested she was trying to comfort someone or something that needed her protection. The pieces of a horrifying puzzle began to fall into place in Frank's mind. The daily tears, the increasing withdrawal, the way Emma protected that backpack like her life depended on it. What if she wasn't just carrying school supplies? What if there was something inside that backpack that explained everything? As the bus pulled into the circular drive at Riverside Elementary, Frank made another decision that went against every protocol in his driver's manual. Instead of his usual routine of supervising the children as they exited, he positioned himself near the front of the bus and watched Emma with laser focus. She stood slowly, cradling the backpack against her chest with both arms, and began to make her way toward the front of the bus. "Have a good day, Emma," Frank said gently as she approached, hoping to catch her eye and perhaps get her to reveal whatever secret she was carrying. For the first time in weeks, Emma looked directly at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, but there was something else there, a desperate kind of hope mixed with paralyzing fear. She opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something, then seemed to think better of it, and hurried past him down the steps. But as she rushed toward the school building, Emma's backpack caught on the metal handrail beside the bus steps. The worn fabric tore slightly, and for just a moment something small and white became visible through the opening. Frank leaned forward, squinting in the morning sunlight, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. Then Emma noticed the tear in her backpack and quickly pressed her hand over it, shooting a terrified glance back at Frank before hurrying away. But it was too late. Frank had seen enough to know that his instincts had been correct. Emma Parker wasn't just crying because of something that was happening to her. She was crying because of something that was happening to someone else. Someone small. Someone helpless. Someone who needed her protection so desperately that she carried them with her everywhere she went, hidden in a purple backpack that had become both a sanctuary and a prison. As Frank watched Emma disappear through the school's front doors, clutching her secret against her chest, he felt a cold certainty settle in his bones. Whatever was in that backpack was the key to understanding Emma's tears, and Frank suspected that when he finally learned the truth, it would be more heartbreaking than anything he'd imagined. The school day stretched ahead of him, 7 long hours, during which Emma would be in her classroom while Frank completed his other routes and responsibilities. But his mind was already racing ahead to 3:15 p.m., when the children would board his bus for the ride home, and Emma would return to seat 12 with her mysterious, precious burden. Today, Frank decided, he was going to find out exactly what Emma Parker was hiding. And if his growing suspicions were correct, today would be the day that changed everything for a little girl who had been carrying far too much responsibility on her 8-year-old shoulders. The school day passed with agonizing slowness for Frank. He completed his midday routes, transporting kindergartners to their half-day program, delivering special needs students to their therapy appointments. But his mind remained fixed on Emma and the glimpse of something white he'd seen through the tear in her backpack. During his lunch break, instead of reading the newspaper in the driver's lounge as was his habit, Frank found himself researching child welfare resources on his phone, preparing for whatever he might discover. At 2:45 p.m., Frank positioned his bus in the pickup line at Riverside Elementary, arriving earlier than usual so he could observe the children as they emerged from the building. Teachers supervised the orderly exodus, calling out bus numbers and helping younger students find their transportation. Frank watched through his windshield as familiar faces appeared. The Martinez twins arguing about something in rapid Spanish. Tommy, the class clown, making exaggerated faces at his friends. Sarah and Jenna walking arm in arm like they were afraid of being separated for even a moment. Then Frank saw Emma. She emerged from the building, walking more slowly than the other children, that purple backpack pressed against her chest like armor. Even from a distance, Frank could see fresh tear tracks on her cheeks and the careful way she moved, as if every step required tremendous effort. When she spotted Frank's bus in the line, something that might have been relief flickered across her face, but it was quickly replaced by the familiar expression of guarded desperation that had become her constant companion. As the children boarded, Frank made sure to greet each one by name, but his attention was entirely focused on Emma. When she climbed the steps, he noticed that she'd used a safety pin to close the tear in her backpack, but the repair was hasty, and the fabric still gaped slightly. More importantly, Emma was whispering again, soft, reassuring words that Frank couldn't quite make out, but that carried the unmistakable tone of someone trying to comfort a frightened living creature. Emma made her way to seat 12, and Frank's heart broke as he watched her settle into her familiar position against the window. Today, however, instead of simply crying in silence, she was actively engaged in what appeared to be a conversation with whatever was hidden in her backpack. She would whisper something, then pause as if listening, then whisper again. At one point, she carefully opened the bag just enough to peek inside, and her expression transformed into something Frank had never seen before, pure, protective love mixed with desperate worry. Frank started the engine and began the route home, but his mind was racing. Every instinct he developed during 15 years of transporting children was screaming that Emma was in crisis, and whatever was in that backpack was at the center of it. He watched in his rearview mirror as she continued her whispered conversation, occasionally reaching into the bag to gently stroke something with her fingertip. As they approached Emma's stop on Sycamore Street, Frank made a decision that would either save a child or cost him his job. Instead of pulling up to the usual spot beneath the oak tree, he parked the bus half a block early, in front of the old Miller house that had been empty for months. The other children barely noticed the change. They were too busy with their own conversations and concerns. But Emma looked up with confusion, and something that might have been panic. Frank set the parking brake and stood up, facing the rows of children behind him. "Everyone stay in your seats for just a minute," he announced in his most authoritative voice. "I need to check something outside." But instead of leaving the bus, Frank walked down the narrow aisle toward seat 12, where Emma sat frozen with terror. As he approached, he could hear it, a sound so soft that it was barely audible over the hum of the diesel engine, but unmistakable once he knew what to listen for. Crying. Not Emma's tears, but the weak, pitiful crying of something very small and very young. Frank knelt beside Emma's seat, his weathered face level with hers. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her hands trembled as she clutched the backpack, the desperate hope and paralyzing fear warring in her expression. "Emma," Frank said gently, his voice barely above a whisper, "Sweetheart, what's in your backpack?" Emma's eyes filled with fresh tears, but for the first time in weeks, she didn't look away from him. "You can't tell," she whispered back, her voice breaking. "Please, Mr. Frank. If anyone finds out, they'll take him away, and he'll die. He's too little. He needs me." Frank felt his heart clench as the pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place. "Who needs you, honey?" Emma looked around nervously at the other children, then leaned closer to Frank. With hands that shook like autumn leaves, she carefully opened her backpack just enough for Frank to see inside. There, nestled among Emma's school supplies on a bed of tissues and her own sweater, was the tiniest kitten Frank had ever seen. The little creature couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 weeks old, far too young to be separated from its mother. Its fur was white with small patches of gray, and its eyes were barely open. The kitten was so small that it fit in the palm of Emma's hand, and it was clear that without her constant care, it wouldn't survive. "I found him in our backyard 4 days ago," Emma whispered, her tears falling freely now. "His mama was gone, and he was all alone and crying. I looked everywhere for her, but she never came back. My dad said if I brought any strays home, he'd take them to the pound, and I know they put babies to sleep if nobody wants them." Frank felt a combination of relief and heartbreak wash over him. This explained everything. Emma's tears, her exhaustion, her increasingly disheveled appearance. She'd been caring for this orphan kitten around the clock, hiding it from her parents, bringing it to school with her because she was afraid to leave it alone. "Honey," Frank said softly, "this little guy needs more help than you can give him by yourself. He needs special food and medicine that only a veterinarian can provide." "But I don't have any money," Emma sobbed. "And my parents, they won't understand. They'll say it's just a stupid animal and throw him away." Frank looked at this brave little girl who had been shouldering the responsibility of keeping another living creature alive, and he knew what he had to do. The other children on the bus were starting to get restless, but Frank ignored them. This moment was about more than school district policies or transportation schedules. This was about a child who had shown more compassion and selflessness than most adults would in the same situation. Emma, Frank said, making a decision that would change both their lives. "Would you trust me to help you save him?" Emma stared at Frank with a mixture of hope and terror that broke his heart all over again. The tiny kitten in her backpack let out another weak mew, and she instinctively moved to comfort it with a gentle stroke of her finger. Around them, the other children were growing restless, with Tommy calling out from the back of the bus asking why they'd stopped, but Frank's entire focus remained on the frightened little girl in seat 12. "How?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "How can you help him?" Frank glanced back at the rows of curious faces behind him, then made a decision that went against every protocol in his driver's manual. "Everyone listen up," he announced, standing and addressing the entire bus. "We're going to make a quick stop before I take you all home. It's very important, and I need everyone to stay calm and quiet." He turned back to Emma, kneeling beside her seat again. "My wife, Margaret, used to volunteer at the animal shelter before she retired. She knows people, good people, who help animals that need special care. But first, we need to get this little guy somewhere safe and warm." Emma's eyes widened. "You mean, you're not going to tell my parents?" Frank considered his words carefully. He understood now why Emma had been so secretive, so terrified. Her family situation was clearly more complex than just financial struggles, and her father's threat about taking strays to the pound revealed a level of callousness that explained Emma's desperate need to handle this crisis alone. "Not yet," Frank said honestly. "First, let's make sure your little friend gets the help he needs. Then we'll figure out the rest together." Emma nodded slowly, fresh tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in weeks, they seemed to be tears of relief rather than desperation. "His name is Whiskers," she said softly. "I know it's not very original, but he's got these tiny white whiskers that tickle when he nuzzles my hand." Frank felt his throat tighten with emotion. This child had been caring for an orphan kitten while dealing with whatever chaos existed at home, getting no sleep, bringing the animal to school every day hidden in her backpack, all because she couldn't bear the thought of letting an innocent creature die. Her compassion was extraordinary, but the burden she'd been carrying was far too heavy for an 8-year-old's shoulders. Frank pulled out his cell phone and dialed Margaret's number. When she answered on the second ring, he could hear the surprise in her voice. He never called during work hours, unless there was an emergency. "Margaret, I need your help," Frank said quietly. "Remember that little girl I've been worried about? Emma? Well, I found out why she's been crying every day, and we have a situation that needs immediate attention." He quickly explained about Whiskers, keeping his voice low so the other children couldn't hear all the details. Margaret listened without interruption, and when Frank finished, there was a moment of silence before she spoke. "Bring them both here," she said without hesitation. "I'll call Dr. Rodriguez at the emergency veterinary clinic. She owes me a favor from my shelter days, and she's wonderful with orphaned animals. How old do you think the kitten is?" Frank looked at Emma, who was listening intently to his half of the conversation. "Emma, sweetheart, when did you say you found Whiskers?" 4 days ago," Emma replied. "But he was already crying when I found him, so his mama might have been gone even longer." Frank relayed this information to Margaret, who made a soft sound of concern. "That's very young to be without a mother. Tell Emma she probably saved his life by taking care of him. I'll have everything ready when you get here." After hanging up, Frank addressed the bus full of children again. "We're going to make a quick stop at my house. It's very important, and everyone needs to stay on the bus while I handle some business. This shouldn't take more than 10 minutes. The questions came immediately from multiple directions. Why are we going to your house? Is everything okay? Are we in trouble? But Frank raised his hand for silence, using the authoritative voice that had kept order on his bus for 15 years. Everything is fine, and no one is in trouble. This is about helping someone who needs our help, and sometimes that's more important than following the regular schedule. Your parents will understand." He looked directly at Emma, who was clutching her backpack even more tightly. "Are you ready to let some good people help Whiskers?" Emma nodded, though Frank could see the fear still lingering in her eyes. She'd been handling this crisis alone for so long that the idea of trusting adults probably felt terrifying. But she was also exhausted and desperate, and the kitten's weak cries were getting more frequent, suggesting that his condition was deteriorating. Frank started the engine and began the short drive to his house on Elm Street, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. He'd probably have to explain this deviation from his route to his supervisor and there might be consequences for involving the student in what was essentially a personal matter. But as he watched Emma in his rearview mirror, gently comforting the tiny creature that depended on her for survival, Frank knew he'd made the right choice. Some things were more important than rules and regulations. Some situations demanded that good people step up and do whatever was necessary to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. And if that meant risking his job to save a kitten and help a little girl who'd shown more courage and compassion than many adults, then Frank was prepared to face whatever consequences came his way. As they pulled into his driveway, Frank could see Margaret waiting on the front porch with a small pet carrier and what appeared to be supplies from her old animal shelter days. Behind him, Emma whispered something to Whiskers, her voice gentle but urgent, as if she was trying to prepare him for the next step in their journey together. Margaret Morrison stood on her front porch like a general preparing for battle, surrounded by supplies that she'd somehow managed to gather in the 15 minutes since Frank's phone call. There was a small pet carrier lined with soft towels, a heating pad, bottles that Frank recognized as emergency kitten formula, and a basket containing various other items that spoke to his wife's years of experience with animal rescue. Frank parked the bus in their driveway and stood to address his passengers one more time. "Remember, everyone stays on the bus. This won't take long, but it's very important." He looked directly at Emma, whose face had gone pale at the sight of all the strangers who would soon know her secret. "Emma, would you like to come with me to meet my wife?" Emma nodded wordlessly, clutching her backpack against her chest as she stood on unsteady legs. Frank could see the exhaustion in every line of her small body. 4 days of round-the-clock kitten care had taken a serious toll on a child who was already dealing with stress at home. As they walked toward the house, Frank placed a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. "Emma, I want you to meet my wife Margaret. She's helped save hundreds of animals over the years, and she's going to know exactly what Whiskers needs." Margaret approached them with the kind of calm confidence that came from years of handling frightened animals and the people who loved them. She knelt down to Emma's eye level, her expression warm and understanding. "You must be Emma," Margaret said softly. "Frank told me how brave you've been, taking care of a tiny kitten all by yourself. That's not easy work, even for adults who know a lot about animals." Emma's eyes filled with tears again, but she managed to speak. "I tried my best, but he's getting weaker. I don't think I'm doing it right." "Oh, sweetheart," Margaret said gently. "The fact that he's still alive after 4 days means you were doing everything right. Orphaned kittens, that young usually don't survive without specialized care. You saved his life by finding him and not giving up." With trembling hands, Emma opened her backpack and carefully lifted out the tiny kitten. Whiskers was even smaller than Frank had initially thought. He couldn't have weighed more than a few ounces. His white fur was soft and clean, evidence of Emma's careful attention to his grooming, but his breathing was shallow and his movements were weak. Margaret examined the kitten with practiced hands, checking his temperature and hydration levels. "He's dehydrated and probably hasn't been getting enough nutrition," she said, "but his basic condition is actually better than I expected. Emma, you did an amazing job keeping him warm and clean." As Margaret prepared a bottle of kitten formula, mixing it to the perfect temperature, she explained to Emma what would happen next. "Dr. Rodriguez is one of the best veterinarians in the city, and she specializes in helping baby animals. She's going to examine Whiskers and give him the medical care he needs. But he's also going to need someone to feed him every 2 hours for the next several weeks, including during the night." Emma's face crumpled. "I can't take him home. My dad said, he said if I brought home any strays, he'd take them to the pound. And my mom, she's got too much to worry about already." Frank and Margaret exchanged a look over Emma's head, a silent communication built on 27 years of marriage. Margaret nodded almost imperceptibly, and Frank felt a wave of love and gratitude for this woman who shared his instinct to help children and animals in need. "Emma," Margaret said carefully, "what if Whiskers stayed here with us while he grows up? Frank and I have raised orphaned animals before, and we have the time and resources to take proper care of him. You could visit him whenever you wanted, and when he's old enough and strong enough, we could talk about what happens next." Emma stared at Margaret as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You would do that? You would take care of him for me?" "We would be honored to," Margaret replied without hesitation. "But there's one condition. You have to promise us that you'll let adults help you, when you're carrying burdens that are too heavy for you to handle alone. What you did for Whiskers was incredibly brave and kind, but you shouldn't have had to do it all by yourself. Emma looked down at the tiny kitten in Margaret's hands, watching as he eagerly latched onto the bottle and began to drink the formula with desperate hunger. For the first time in days, Whiskers seemed to have real energy, his tiny paws kneading against Margaret's palm as he fed. "He's really going to be okay?" Emma whispered. "With proper care, I think he's going to be just fine," Margaret assured her. "He's a fighter, just like the little girl who saved him." Frank checked his watch and realized they'd been off the bus for nearly 10 minutes. The other children were probably getting restless, and parents would start worrying if the bus was too late arriving at its remaining stops. But as he watched Emma's face transform from desperation to hope, he knew that every minute of this detour had been worth it. "We need to get back on the road," Frank said gently. "But Emma, Margaret is going to take Whiskers to see Dr. Rodriguez right now, and I'll call you tonight to let you know how he's doing. Is that okay?" Emma nodded, then did something that surprised everyone. She hugged Margaret tightly, burying her face against the older woman's shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for saving him." Margaret hugged her back, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you for saving him first. You're a very special little girl, Emma Parker." As they walked back to the bus, Frank noticed that Emma's entire demeanor had changed. Her steps were lighter, her shoulders less hunched, and for the first time in weeks, she wasn't crying. The other children barely looked up as she returned to her seat. They'd become so accustomed to her quiet presence that they hardly noticed her comings and goings. But Frank noticed everything. He watched in his rearview mirror as Emma settled into seat 12 and for the first time since he'd been driving her, actually looked out the window with something resembling peace in her expression. She still looked exhausted. 4 days of minimal sleep couldn't be cured in a single afternoon. But the desperate edge to her suffering had been replaced by something Frank recognized as cautious hope. As the bus pulled away from his house, Frank saw Margaret carefully loading the pet carrier into her car, preparing for the trip to the emergency veterinary clinic. He felt a surge of pride and love for his wife, who had stepped into this crisis without hesitation and offered exactly the kind of help that Emma had needed, but been too afraid to ask for. The remainder of the route passed without incident. Children disembarked at their usual stops, calling out their goodbyes and plans for the evening. When they reached Emma's stop on Sycamore Street, Frank watched as she gathered her now empty backpack and prepared to face whatever waited for her at home. "Emma," Frank called softly as she reached the front of the bus. She turned back to look at him, and Frank was struck again by how young she looked, how young she actually was. 8 years old, carrying worries and responsibilities that would challenge adults. "You did the right thing," Frank told her. "Caring about something that needed help, even when it was hard, even when you were scared, that takes real courage. I'm proud of you." Emma's eyes filled with tears again, but this time Frank could see they were tears of relief and gratitude, rather than despair. "Will you really call me tonight, to tell me how Whiskers is doing?" "I promise," Frank said. "And Emma? If you ever need help with anything else, anything at all, you know where to find me." Emma nodded and stepped off the bus, but instead of the defeated, fearful walk Frank had observed for weeks, she moved with purpose toward her front door. She still had whatever challenges waited for her at home, but she was no longer carrying them entirely alone. As Frank watched her disappear into the house, he realized that this day had changed something fundamental in their relationship. Emma now knew that there were adults in her world who would listen, who would help, who would step in when a situation became too overwhelming for a child to handle alone. And Frank had learned something important too. Sometimes the most profound acts of heroism came in the smallest packages, from the most unexpected sources. 3 weeks later, Frank's morning routine had taken on a dramatically different quality. As he completed his pre-trip inspection and prepared for the day's first route, he found himself actually looking forward to stop number 7 on Sycamore Street, where a transformation had been taking place one day at a time. The change in Emma had been gradual but unmistakable. The first morning after Whiskers' rescue, she had boarded the bus with red-rimmed eyes, not from crying, but from what Frank suspected was the first full night's sleep she'd had in weeks. Her school uniform was clean and properly pressed, her hair neatly braided, and while she still carried her purple backpack, it no longer seemed to weigh her down like a burden too heavy to bear. More importantly, Emma had begun to engage with the world around her again. She'd started with small interactions, a shy good morning to Frank, a tentative smile when he asked how she was feeling. Then, gradually, she'd begun to notice the other children on the bus, even participating in conversations about homework and weekend plans. Frank had kept his promise to call Emma that first night, sharing the good news that Dr. Rodriguez had examined Whiskers and declared him to be malnourished but otherwise healthy. The kitten would need several weeks of careful feeding and monitoring, but his prognosis was excellent. Margaret had volunteered to handle a round-the-clock feeding schedule, and Emma was welcome to visit whenever she wanted. That visit arrangement had led to an unexpected development. When Frank had mentioned Emma's situation to Margaret, carefully and without revealing details that weren't his to share, his wife had immediately suggested that Emma might benefit from spending some time in a stable, nurturing environment. What had started as weekend visits to check on Whiskers had evolved into Emma becoming an unofficial part of the Morrison household. Emma's parents, Frank had learned, were dealing with their own complex set of challenges. Her father worked double shifts at a factory to make ends meet, while her mother struggled with depression and anxiety that made daily functioning difficult. They weren't cruel or abusive people, but they were overwhelmed and emotionally unavailable, leaving Emma to navigate childhood largely on her own. When Margaret had gently approached them about Emma spending weekends at the Morrison house, framed as a way for her to help with Whiskers' care, Emma's parents had agreed with what seemed like relief. They loved their daughter, but they were barely managing their own survival, and Emma's natural tendency to take on responsibility had made it easy for them to overlook how much she was struggling. This morning, as Emma climbed the steps of Frank's bus, she was carrying more than just her school supplies. In a small, ventilated container, approved by the school principal, she had Whiskers, now strong enough for short outings and socialized enough to enjoy meeting new people. The kitten had become something of a class mascot, with Emma's teacher incorporating his care into lessons about responsibility and biology. "Good morning, Mr. Frank," Emma said brightly as she passed his seat, her voice carrying a confidence that had been absent for months. "Good morning, Emma," Frank replied, his heart warming at the sight of her genuine smile. "How's our friend Whiskers doing today?" Emma's face lit up as she carefully adjusted the carrier to show Frank the kitten inside. Whiskers had grown significantly in 3 weeks, his white fur now full and fluffy, his gray patches more distinct, and his eyes bright and alert. He was still small for his age, but Dr. Rodriguez had pronounced him completely healthy and well on his way to becoming a normal, active kitten. "He learned how to use the litter box all by himself," Emma announced proudly, "and Mrs. Morrison says he's almost old enough to stop drinking from a bottle. He tries to eat the big cat food sometimes, but he still needs the special kitten formula." Frank smiled at Emma's use of Mrs. Morrison rather than Margaret, a small formality that spoke to the respect and gratitude she felt toward the woman who had helped save Whiskers, and in many ways had helped save Emma too. As Emma made her way to seat 12, Frank noticed that her usual spot by the window was no longer a place of isolation. Sarah and Jenna, the best friends who'd previously been absorbed in their own social bubble, had begun including Emma in their conversations. Tommy the class clown had appointed himself as Whiskers' official entertainer, making funny faces and sounds to get the kitten's attention. Even the Martinez twins had started practicing their English by teaching Emma Spanish words for different animals. The transformation wasn't just social, it was academic as well. Emma's teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had reported that Emma's grades had improved dramatically once she was no longer falling asleep at her desk or missing assignments due to exhaustion. Her natural intelligence, no longer hampered by the stress of her secret burden, was finally able to shine through. Frank had also noticed changes in Emma's relationship with her parents. The weekend arrangements with the Morrisons had created opportunities for Emma's mother and father to focus on their own healing and stability, without the added pressure of meeting all of their daughter's emotional needs. Emma's father had even stopped by Frank's house one Saturday afternoon, ostensibly to check on his daughter, but really to thank Frank and Margaret for their kindness. "I know we should have been the ones to help her," he'd said quietly, standing in the Morrisons' kitchen, while Emma and Margaret fed Whiskers in the living room. "But we were drowning, you know. Both of us working so hard just to keep our heads above water that we didn't see how much she was struggling." Frank had assured him that there was no judgment, only gratitude that they'd been able to help when help was needed. Families went through difficult periods, and sometimes the most important thing was recognizing when outside support could make a difference. As the bus pulled into the circular drive at Riverside Elementary, Frank watched Emma gather her things with the efficient movements of a child who was no longer carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. She stood and walked toward the front of the bus, stopping briefly to say goodbye to the other children who'd become her friends. "Have a good day, sweetheart," Frank said as she reached the steps. "You too, Mr. Frank," Emma replied. Then, with the kind of thoughtfulness that still surprised him, she added, "Thank you for everything." Frank watched her walk toward the school building, her step light and confident, Whiskers carrier held carefully in her hands. Other children surrounded her, eager to see the kitten and hear about his latest adventures. Emma was no longer the isolated, desperately sad little girl who'd cried alone in seat 12. She was a child who'd learned that asking for help was a sign of strength, not weakness, and that there were adults in the world who would step up when children needed them most. As Frank prepared to continue his route, he reflected on how a single decision to look more closely, to care more deeply, had changed multiple lives. Emma was thriving, Whiskers was healthy and loved, and Frank and Margaret had gained an honorary granddaughter who brought joy and purpose to their empty nest. But perhaps most importantly, Emma had learned lessons that would serve her throughout her life. That compassion for others was one of humanity's greatest virtues, that asking for help was an act of courage, and that sometimes the most profound connections were forged in moments of shared crisis and mutual support. 6 months after the rescue of Whiskers, Frank Morrison stood in the auditorium of Riverside Elementary School, adjusting his rarely worn suit jacket and trying to calm the nervous flutter in his stomach. The occasion was the school's annual Recognition Day, where students, teachers, and community members were honored for acts of service and exceptional character. Frank had attended these ceremonies before as a proud spectator when his own daughters were students here decades ago, but he'd never imagined he'd be sitting in the front row as an honoree himself. The irony wasn't lost on him that this recognition had come not from 15 years of safely transporting thousands of children, but from a single moment when he'd chosen to break protocol and follow his heart. The local newspaper had picked up Emma's story after she'd written about Whiskers for a school project, and the article about the bus driver who'd helped rescue an orphan kitten had resonated with readers far beyond Cedar Falls. But for Frank, the real recognition was sitting 3 rows behind him, where Emma Parker was fidgeting in her best dress while trying to keep Whiskers, now a sleek, healthy 6-month-old cat, calm in his travel carrier. Emma had insisted that Whiskers be present for the ceremony, arguing with irrefutable 8-year-old logic that none of this would have happened without him. The past 6 months had brought changes that Frank could never have anticipated when he first noticed a little girl crying on his bus. Emma had not only recovered from her period of crisis, but had emerged as a confident, compassionate leader among her peers. She'd started an after-school club called Paw Prints that educated other children about animal care and raised money for the local shelter where Margaret still volunteered. More significantly, Emma's family situation had stabilized in ways that spoke to the power of community support and professional intervention. The weekend arrangement with the Morrisons had evolved into a broader support network that included counseling services for Emma's parents, job training that had helped her father move into a less stressful position, and treatment for her mother's depression that had dramatically improved the family's overall functioning. Emma's parents now sat in the audience as well, their faces beaming with pride as they watched their daughter receive recognition for her Outstanding Young Citizen Award. The transformation in their family dynamic had been remarkable, from a household where everyone was drowning separately to one where they'd learned to support each other through difficulties. Principal Watson approached the podium and began the ceremony with remarks about the importance of recognizing everyday heroes. "Sometimes," she said, looking directly at Frank, "the most extraordinary acts of courage and kindness happen in the most ordinary circumstances. Today we're honoring individuals who saw a need and chose to act, who put compassion before convenience, and who remind us all that making a difference doesn't require grand gestures, just open hearts and willing hands." When Emma's name was called for her award, Frank felt his throat tighten with emotion as he watched her walk across the stage with poise that belied her age. She accepted her certificate with a gracious smile, then surprised everyone by asking for the microphone. "I want to thank Mr. Frank Morrison," Emma said, her voice clear and strong as it carried through the auditorium. "6 months ago, I thought I had to handle everything by myself because I was scared of what would happen if I asked for help. Mr. Frank taught me that good people want to help when someone is in trouble, and that it's okay to trust adults who show you they care." She paused, looking directly at Frank with the kind of mature gratitude that comes from truly understanding how close disaster had come. "He saved Whiskers, but he also saved me," And he taught me that when you have the power to help someone, even if it's risky or inconvenient, that's what you should do." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Frank barely heard it over the sound of his own heart pounding with pride and joy. This child, who had been so lost and frightened just months ago, was now articulating principles of compassion and community service that some adults never fully grasped. When Frank's own recognition was announced, the Community Hero Award for his actions in helping Emma and Whiskers, he accepted it with humility and gratitude. But in his brief remarks, he made sure to redirect the focus where it belonged. "The real hero in this story," Frank said, looking out at the audience until he found Emma's face, "is a little girl who found a helpless animal and refused to let it die, even when caring for it meant sacrificing her own comfort and safety. Emma Parker showed more courage and selflessness in 1 week than most people show in a lifetime. I was just lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time to help her carry a burden that was too heavy for anyone to bear alone." After the ceremony, as families gathered in the school lobby for refreshments and conversation, Frank found himself surrounded by well-wishers and people wanting to hear more details about the rescue. But his attention was drawn to a quieter corner where Emma sat on the floor, letting Whiskers explore his surroundings while being carefully supervised by both sets of her parents, her biological mother and father, and Frank and Margaret, who had become honorary family members. Whiskers had grown into a beautiful cat, his white fur pristine and his gray patches perfectly symmetrical. But more than his physical beauty, he radiated the confidence and affection of an animal who had been loved and cared for from his most vulnerable moments. He moved between Emma and Margaret with equal comfort, a living bridge between the girl who had saved him and the woman who had helped raise him. Frank approached the group and knelt down beside Emma, scratching Whiskers behind the ears and marveling at how much had changed since that desperate morning when he'd first glimpsed something white through a torn backpack. "You know what the best part of this whole story is?" Frank said to Emma, who looked up at him with curiosity. "What's that, Mr. Frank?" Frank smiled, thinking about all the lessons learned and lives changed over the past 6 months. "It's that Whiskers isn't the only one who was rescued. We all saved each other in different ways." Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important matters, then nodded with understanding beyond her years. "Like how you and Mrs. Morrison saved me and Whiskers, but we also gave you something to care about?" "Exactly like that," Frank confirmed. "And how your parents learned to ask for help when they needed it? And how you learned that you don't have to carry heavy burdens all by yourself?" As if summoned by the conversation, Margaret approached with a small wrapped package in her hands. "This is for you, Emma," she said, settling down on the floor beside them. "A little something to remember this day." Emma opened the package carefully, revealing a delicate silver bracelet with a small charm in the shape of a cat. But it wasn't just any cat. It was a perfect miniature replica of Whiskers, complete with his distinctive gray patches and alert expression. "It's beautiful," Emma breathed, holding up her wrist so Margaret could fasten the clasp. "I'll wear it always." "There's something else," Margaret said with a mysterious smile. "Dr. Rodriguez called this morning. She wanted you to know that the special kitten formula we use to help Whiskers grow strong has been donated to animal shelters across the state. They're calling it Emma's Formula, because your story inspired a pet food company to develop a better product for orphaned animals." Emma's eyes went wide with amazement. "You mean Whiskers is going to help other baby animals get healthy?" "That's exactly what it means," Frank said, feeling his heart swell with pride at this final piece of the story's completion. "Your kindness and courage didn't just save one kitten, it's going to save hundreds of animals for years to come." As the evening wound down and families began to head home, Frank reflected on the unexpected ways that life could change in a single moment of decision. 6 months ago, he'd been a school bus driver nearing retirement, content with his routine and satisfied with his contributions to his community. Today, he was a recognized hero whose actions had rippled outward in ways he could never have imagined. But more than any public recognition or newspaper articles, Frank treasured the knowledge that a little girl who had once cried alone in seat 12 now smiled every morning when she boarded his bus. Emma had learned that asking for help was a sign of strength, that adults could be trusted to care about children's welfare, and that her own capacity for compassion could make a real difference in the world. As Frank watched Emma carefully place Whiskers back in his carrier and gather her awards and gifts, he realized that this story wasn't really about a rescued kitten, or even about a bus driver who broke some rules to help a child in need. It was about the fundamental truth that Margaret had articulated that first evening when she told him to look closer. Sometimes the answers to life's most important questions were hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone who cared enough to pay attention. The bond between Frank and Emma would continue long after she outgrew the need for school bus transportation. They had become family in the way that sometimes happens when people meet each other in moments of crisis and choose to respond with love instead of indifference. Whiskers would grow old in a house full of people who adored him. Emma would carry the lessons of this experience into adulthood, and Frank would finish his career knowing that sometimes the most important job of any adult is simply to notice when a child needs help, and then to provide it without reservation. As they walked out into the warm spring evening, Emma slipped her hand into Frank's weathered one and looked up at him with the clear, trusting gaze of a child who had learned that the world, despite its challenges, was full of people willing to help when help was needed most. "Thank you, Mr. Frank," she said simply. "For everything." Frank squeezed her hand gently, thinking about all the mornings yet to come when Emma would board his bus with a smile instead of tears, when Whiskers would purr contentedly in his sunny spot by Margaret's kitchen window, and when a community that had come together to help one small girl and one tiny kitten would continue to be a little bit kinder, a little bit more watchful, and a little bit more willing to believe in the power of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. "Thank you, Emma," Frank replied, meaning it with every fiber of his being, "for reminding me what really matters." What moment in this story resonated with you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this narrative, please subscribe to my channel. Your support means the world to me, and helps keep these stories coming.